Okay, earlier in lecture we talked about, in some of the first lectures, we talked about regions and realms. And realms is the way that our book has the world organized in these global neighborhoods. And they also correspond to the chapters in the book. And the numbering is going to be a little off, one off, but these are the numbered realms. And note in the previous edition of the book, the chapters are actually numbered this way. Chapter 1 was North America. In this version of the book, in the 8th edition, they called the introduction chapter chapter 1, and so they're a little bit off. But anyway, that aside, these are the realms and the order that we're going to go in. We're going to follow the order that they are in the book, starting with 1, the North American realm. In the future, we're going to move on and talk about the Middle American realm, South American realm, and then on through the rest of them. And so that's the way the book is organized. So what we're going to look at now is the North American realm. And here's a map of the North American realm. It includes the United States, Canada, which we'll talk more about Greenland in the future, but we'll really focus on the United States and Canada. And we'll kind of squeeze it in this first part of the class, and probably not, we'll probably go a little bit shorter on North America than we will on some other parts of the world, just because we're a little bit more familiar with it. But I do want to highlight some key things about it. Okay, first off, I want to, and the list in the book is a little bit longer than this. I added a few additional ones in here, but a couple of things I want to highlight as you're getting into the subsequent chapters of the book is I want you to pay particular attention to the concepts, ideas, and terms. Some of these will show up in lecture, some of them will not. And even if they don't show up in lecture, I want to make sure that you understand what all these concepts mean in your reading. And the other thing that I'll highlight from the chapter is that the chapter starts with some of the major geographic qualities of these places. And so some of these we may cover in more detail, some of these we may kind of skip over, but make sure you kind of understand these. So, for example, that this realm includes 2 of the world's largest states in terms of their size or their territory. So United States and Canada are really big countries, not the biggest, but 2 of the largest. They're both federal states. They're both what we call plural society. I may not cover this in lecture, but understand about Canada having different languages. There are English and French in Canada. Both are highly urbanized and mobile societies, and we'll talk a little about that, but we'll really contrast that when we talk about other parts of the world. Same goes with high income rates and high rates of consumption, manufacturing. The US-Mexico border is like kind of the border between the North American realm and what we'll call the Middle American realm that we'll discuss later. And also multicultural realms with different cultures that come together. A lot of that due to migration. This is from a different textbook, but I do want to just show this before we begin, that both United States and Canada, one thing that they share in common is that you can consider them what's called a land empire, that they start with sort of a core area, like the original 13 colonies of the US or the eastern seaboard in Canada, and they both expanded westward and into until they reached the Pacific Ocean. One thing that we'll see, and then even up to Alaska, and one thing that we'll see in the future is we'll contrast that with, or compare that to the Russian realm, where in Russia, they expanded the same way, but going in the opposite direction. So I just want to show you this, and we'll discuss it later on in the semester. We have 2 of the largest countries in the world. After Russia, Russia is the largest country in terms of its size, and China is up there as well. Canada is number 2, and the US is 3 or 4, depending on how you count land area versus water with China. But that being said, 2 of the largest countries in the world in terms of their area. But their populations are quite different. The US is the 4th largest country in the world with 327 million people. So it's one of the top 5 countries in terms of population. Canada, it's more than 10%, but let's just say 10% just to make a comparison. In other words, the population of Canada is very similar to the population of California. So California, as a state in the United States, actually has more people than the whole country of Canada. So US, big population, smaller one in Canada. And let's talk about where these populations are concentrated. We have to pick something real quick. I'm going to fix this on the fly. So in the United States, most of our population is really concentrated on our coastal areas, especially in the West. We have right along the coast, Seattle, Portland, Bay Area, Los Angeles. Coastal areas in the East are also highly populated. Now, one thing unique about Canada is its population is clustered very near the border of the United States. So most of its population would live within a kind of a tight zone close to the United States. And one reason for that is that when you go further north, you get into some really cold and wet forested areas, and it can be quite difficult conditions. So most of the population is really close to the border. Both the US and Canada have a high degree of cultural diversity in the ancestry and historical backgrounds of their populations. But they're a little bit different from each other, that most of the cultural diversity in Canada are with people from Asia, both South Asia, like India and Pakistan, and East Asia, which would be like China and also places, you know, China, Korea, Japan, and also Southeast Asia, like Vietnam. In the United States, our diversity, we are diverse as well, but in kind of a different way. You're probably more familiar with this. The largest minority are people who would be considered of Hispanic background. Also, African Americans make up a large percent. These numbers, the percentages may be a little out of date, but they're pretty close. Asian Americans make are a significant minority, and people of all kinds of other ethnic backgrounds. And a lot of this is due to the to migration patterns into the United States. And this is a pretty old figure, but from an old textbook, but I kind of like the way that it's illustrated here, that what this shows is the population patterns of people immigrating into the United States, and the size of the arrow indicates the number of people. And so if you look at the United States, if you want to know the biggest source of migrants, the largest source is Mexico, which really makes geographic sense because Mexico is right next to the United States. On the other hand, Canada is right next to the United States as well, but is not as large a source of migrants. Two reasons there. One, Mexico is a larger country, but also the disparity in the pay rates are different as well. That you know, what you're paid on a job in Canada is not that different than the United States, but the wage disparity with Mexico is quite different. So that can help drive that as well. In Canada, the largest source of migrants are from China. So Asia is really the larger source of migrants. And China, Philippines, India, places in Asia. Now, one thing you may notice is, let's say the United Kingdom, England, let's say, they don't even show up here, even though that people in the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, those places, they speak English, so it'd be pretty easy for them to move to the United States. But likewise, there's not as much incentive for them to move to the United States because conditions, economic conditions, are so similar in England to the United States that there's not a lot of what we call pull factors drawing them in. So let's talk about those factors and the types of migration. These may not necessarily be in the book, but generally we can talk about different kinds of migrants. Selective migrants are those that are responding to what we call pull factors. They're being drawn to a place, essentially getting a better job. It could be also educational opportunities or whatever is kind of drawing you to a place. So, for example, if someone is, say, construction worker in Mexico, and the wages in the United States are higher than they are in Mexico, so they move so that they can get a higher paying job. That would be an example of a selective migrant, or an IT worker from a South Asian, from India, moving to Silicon Valley because the rates of pay are higher, that sort of thing. Non-selective migrants are responding to push factors. They're being essentially pushed out of where they live because of starvation or war and what have you. Right now, it's not reflected well here, but we have a high amount of migrants from Central America, places like El Salvador and Honduras. And oftentimes they're actually responding to both, that there is both a draw for people who want to get better jobs, but also a great deal of gang violence or crop failure, things that are really kind of pushing people out of Central America as well. So oftentimes it can be confusing if it's, are people, non-selective migrants are also called refugees. Are people really refugees, or are they going to get make better opportunities for themselves? And sometimes it's both. Now, I just want to point out a few when it comes to the different groups of people in the United States, are different cultural groups. This is geography. We talk about how things occur over space. There are some spatial patterns to it. So these are showing the percent of different groups. The percent Hispanic are concentrated. The highest percentage of Hispanic people are concentrated in the Southwest: Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. And that makes geographic sense because these are the states that are nearest to Mexico and places further south. And those are often the source regions. Although, people of Hispanic origin have been in the Southwest even before the United States was the United States. A lot of it had been Mexico, but most of this comes from migration over time. The Southwest wasn't that very populated until fairly recently in US history. Now, percent African American is a different pattern, that the highest concentrations are in the Southeast. And this is a relic of slavery, that these are the parts of the United States where you had plantation economies and people who were brought in slavery in US history. And that still echoes in the current distribution of the percentage of people who are African American. Percent Asian is somewhat similar to the percent Hispanic, but it's coastal. It's across the Pacific. It's really in the west, the Pacific part of the United States, which is kind of closest geographically, even though there's an ocean in between. And then the percent Native American is a much more complicated pattern because of the system of reservations and treaties that have happened. There, it's a little bit more complex. It's not, I can't give you an easy answer because it's just a long, complicated history. Another key feature of the United States and Canada, we're both federal systems. We have federalism, which means a mix of central government and regional governments. So in other words, we have, in the United States, we have our federal government, the president, Congress, but we also have a California government, which has certain powers as well. In the US, we have our states, which we're familiar with. And in Canada, they're called provinces. And provinces are similar to the concept of states in the United States. There are some powers that the federal government holds, but also some powers that the provinces hold. Now, not all countries are like this. Not all countries have states or provinces, and they just have one central government. These are called a unitary government. We'll talk more about unitary governments in the future when we get to it. Now, one thing I want to point out, just as for terminology, is because it's a little unfortunate the United States that we call these states, and at one time they were like little mini countries, but nowadays we call them states, but states is also a term that means a country. So the United States is a state, and then it's composed of states, and that can be a little confusing, but most of the time on a worldwide basis, when we talk about a state, we're talking about what we would in the US call a country: US, Mexico, Russia, and so on. And the idea is that these have sovereignty, that they control what happens within their borders. And I also want to differentiate that with the term nation. And we always, even when you hear people on TV talking about this great nation of ours, nations are more about a cohesive group of people. And they don't always have a state. We're going to see examples in the future of nations of people who don't have their own territory. They live in other territories, other states.